Have you ever seen someone collapse at the sight of something they thought was impossible? At a bustling Navy base, a quiet single father named Dorian worked in the shadows, mocked by his co-workers for wearing a scratched, worthless-looking watch. When an admiral arrived for inspection, junior officers pushed Dorian forward as a joke, telling the admiral to check out the antique on his wrist. The admiral played along, amused and expecting a trinket. But the moment Dorian turned his wrist, everything changed. The admiral's face drained of color, his knees buckled, and the room went dead silent. What was on that watch, and why did it make a decorated military leader look like he'd just seen a ghost? From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories of hidden heroes and long-buried truths, please consider subscribing. Because what happened next revealed a secret the government spent a decade trying to erase. The hangar smelled like hydraulic fluid and exhaust fumes, a mix of metal and heat that clung to the back of the throat. The morning sun angled through the open bay doors of Naval Air Station Oceana, casting long shadows across rows of fighter jets in various states of maintenance. Men in khaki uniforms moved with purpose between the aircraft, their voices sharp with authority and precision. In the far corner, hunched over a hydraulic lift with a wrench in one hand and a grease-stained rag in the other, Dorian Ashlock worked in silence. He was easy to miss, the kind of man who blended into the background by habit rather than accident. His coveralls were the same faded gray as the concrete floor, worn thin at the knees and elbows. His face carried the weathered lines of someone who had spent years squinting into the sun, but his eyes remained focused and calm, always scanning, always calculating. He moved with an efficiency that suggested muscle memory rather than enthusiasm. Every bolt tightened, every seal checked, every task completed without complaint or conversation. The civilian maintenance crew filtered in as the morning shift began. Most of them were younger men, veterans who had taken contractor jobs after leaving active duty. They carried themselves with a casual confidence, swapping stories about weekend plans and sports scores as they clocked in. Dorian arrived exactly on time, as he always did, carrying a dented metal thermos and a lunch bag that looked like it had seen better days. He nodded to the security officer at the gate, scanned his badge, and walked through the hangar without making eye contact. Grissom noticed him first. He always did. Grissom was in his mid-20s, broad-shouldered and quick to laugh, the kind of guy who thrived on being the center of attention. He had served 4 years in the Navy as an aviation mechanic before taking a civilian position on the same base, and he wore that experience like a badge of honor. To Grissom, the hierarchy was clear. Active duty personnel were at the top. Veterans turned contractors came next. And then there were guys like Dorian, civilians who had never served, who punched a clock and went home without ever understanding what it meant to wear the uniform. Grissom elbowed the guy next to him and jerked his chin toward Dorian. "Morning, Grandpa," he called out, his voice carrying across the hangar floor. Dorian glanced up briefly, offered a slight nod, and continued walking toward his workstation. He set his thermos down on the metal bench, pulled on a pair of work gloves, and picked up his clipboard. His routine was the same every day. Check the task list. Prioritize by urgency. Start with the systems that would ground an aircraft if left unchecked. No shortcuts, no distractions. Grissom turned to another tech, a younger guy named Fellman, who had only been on the crew for a few months. "Dude still wears that busted watch," Grissom said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Probably got it at a yard sale." Fellman glanced over at Dorian, squinting to see what Grissom was talking about. The watch was impossible to miss once you looked for it. It hung loose on Dorian's wrist, the leather strap cracked and discolored from years of sweat and grime. The face was scratched, the glass cloudy, and the metal casing looked like it had been through a blender. It was the kind of watch someone kept, not because it worked well, but because throwing it away felt wrong. Lena, the lead technician for the civilian crew, walked past and caught the tail end of the conversation. She was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, the kind of person who had earned respect through competence rather than charm. She shot Grissom a look that could have stripped paint. "Leave him alone," she said quietly. "He does his job, goes home. That is it." Grissom raised his hands in mock surrender, grinning. "Just making conversation, Lena." "No harm." Lena did not respond. She walked over to Dorian's station and set a work order on his bench. Hydraulic line replacement on the F-18 in Bay 3, she said. Needs to be done before noon. Dorian looked up from his clipboard, scanned the work order, and nodded. Understood. Lena lingered for a moment, studying him. There was something about Dorian that always made her pause. The way he moved, the way he held himself. It was too controlled, too deliberate. Most of the techs slouched when they worked, leaned against tool carts, took smoke breaks every hour. Dorian never slouched, never wasted emotion. His posture was too precise, his focus too sharp. It reminded her of the way instructors moved at boot camp, the ones who had seen real combat and carried it in their bones. She shook the thought away and moved on to the next station. Whatever Dorian's story was, it was not her business. He showed up on time, did excellent work, and never caused problems. That was more than she could say for half the crew. The morning passed in the steady rhythm of mechanical work. Wrenches turned, air, compressors hissed. Radio chatter crackled over the intercom as pilots prepared for training flights. Dorian worked methodically, replacing the hydraulic line with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. His hands never fumbled. His measurements were exact. When he finished, he ran a pressure test, checked for leaks, and logged the work in the maintenance system. No fanfare, no pride. Just another task completed. At noon, the lunch whistle blew. The hangar crew filtered toward the break room, a cramped space with flickering fluorescent lights and vending machines that only worked half the time. Dorian stayed at his station, pulling a sandwich from his lunch bag. It was wrapped in wax paper, homemade, the bread slightly squashed from being packed too tightly. He ate slowly, methodically, his eyes distant. His phone buzzed on the bench. He picked it up and read the message. "Dad, can you pick me up early today? Science fair setup." Dorian's expression softened. He typed back quickly, his thumbs moving with surprising speed, for someone who looked like he had never touched a smartphone before. 3:15, I will be there. He set the phone down and stared at the wallpaper for a moment. The photo showed a little girl with dark hair pulled into a ponytail, holding a homemade volcano made of papier-mâché and painted red. She was grinning at the camera, her front teeth slightly crooked, her eyes bright with excitement. Dorian allowed himself a small smile, the kind that softened the hard lines of his face and made him look almost young again. Grissom wandered past, soda in hand, and caught sight of the photo. He stopped, leaning over Dorian's shoulder with exaggerated curiosity. "Aw, Grandpa has got a kid?" he said, loud enough for the whole break room to hear. "Didn't think you had it in you, man." Dorian closed his phone and set it face down on the bench. He did not look at Grissom, did not respond, just took another bite of his sandwich. Grissom laughed and nudged Fellman. "Seriously, though, how old is this guy? 50? 60? Raising a kid at his age, that is rough." Lena, sitting at the far end of the break room, set down her coffee with more force than necessary. "Knock it off," she said sharply. "He is raising her alone. Show some respect." Grissom rolled his eyes but backed off. "Respect for what?" he muttered under his breath. "Guy is a glorified janitor." The afternoon shift began with the same quiet efficiency. Dorian moved from one task to the next, his clipboard always in hand, his tools always clean. He worked alone, preferring the solitude to the banter and camaraderie that filled the rest of the hangar. The other techs had learned not to bother him. He was polite but distant, the kind of guy who answered questions with as few words as possible and never volunteered information about himself. At 2:30, the base-wide intercom crackled to life. The voice that came through was crisp and professional, the kind of announcement that made everyone stop what they were doing. "Attention, all personnel. Admiral Soren Blackwell will be conducting a surprise inspection of Hangar 7 at 1500 hours. All stations prepare for review." The effect was immediate. Officers straightened their uniforms. Junior techs scrambled to clean their workstations. Lena grabbed a clipboard and started barking orders, directing people to organize tool carts and double-check maintenance logs. The energy in the hangar shifted from casual efficiency to controlled chaos. Grissom's face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Blackwell," he said, turning to Fellman. "Dude, this is huge. Blackwell is a legend. He ran JSOC operations in Syria. I heard he personally coordinated the takedown of an ISIS commander in Raqqa." Fellman looked impressed. "You think he will talk to us?" Grissom shrugged. "Room as him is insane." Lena walked past, her expression tight. "Stay out of his way," she said curtly. "Smile, nod, and do not touch anything unless he asks." At his workstation, Dorian continued tightening bolts on a fuel pump assembly. His face showed no reaction to the announcement, no excitement, no nervousness. Just the same calm focus he brought to every task. He glanced at his watch, noted the time, and returned to his work. Grissom noticed. He leaned over to Fellman and whispered, "Bet you $10 Grandpa does not even know who Blackwell is." Fellman smirked but said nothing. At exactly 1500 hours, the hangar doors opened. The first thing everyone noticed was the sound, the sharp click of polished shoes on concrete, the rustle of dress uniforms, the low murmur of aides conferring in hushed tones. And then Admiral Soren Blackwell stepped into the hangar, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He was in his late 50s, tall and lean, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp. His uniform was immaculate, the kind of precision that came from decades of military discipline. His chest was covered in ribbons, rows of commendations and service medals that told the story of a career spent in the most dangerous corners of the world. But it was his presence that commanded attention. He moved with the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. People straightened their spines without thinking. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Blackwell walked the line of parked aircraft, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning every detail. He paused at a hydraulic pump, ran his fingers along a fuel line, checked the maintenance log clipped to the nose gear. His questions were sharp and specific, delivered in a voice that expected immediate answers. "This hydraulic system," he said to a nervous ensign standing nearby. "Last maintenance check?" the ensign stammered. 2 weeks ago, sir." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "Show me the logs." The ensign fumbled with his tablet, scrolling frantically. Blackwell did not wait. He moved on, his expression unreadable. In the background, Dorian continued working. He was not part of the inspection, not part of the lineup of officers and techs standing at attention. He was just another civilian contractor, invisible and unimportant. He tightened the last bolt on the fuel pump, wiped his hands on a rag, and reached for his clipboard. Blackwell's inspection brought him closer to the civilian maintenance area. Officers trailed behind him, their faces tight with concentration. Junior techs stood at parade rest, trying not to look nervous. And then Grissom saw his opportunity. "Admiral Blackwell, sir," Grissom called out, his voice loud and eager. Blackwell paused. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Grissom with the kind of focus that made the younger man falter for half a second. "Yes?" Blackwell said. Grissom grinned, trying to recover his confidence. "You ever seen real military history, sir?" Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Grissom pointed across the hangar, directly at Dorian. "Ashlock over there. That watch he wears? Calls it his service record. It is the only military thing he has ever touched." Laughter rippled through the junior techs. A few officers smirked. Lena closed her eyes and shook her head, embarrassed. Blackwell's expression did not change. He looked in the direction Grissom was pointing, his gaze settling on the quiet man in the faded coveralls. "That's so," he said, his tone neutral. "Let us have a look." He began walking toward Dorian. The hangar went quiet. All eyes followed the Admiral as he crossed the concrete floor, his polished shoes clicking in the silence. Dorian looked up from his clipboard. He met Blackwell's gaze without flinching, his expression calm and unreadable. "Sir," Dorian said quietly, "it is nothing. Just a watch." Blackwell stopped a few feet away. "Humor me," he said. Dorian set down his wrench. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his wrist. The watch came into view, scratched, worn. The leather strap cracked and discolored, the metal casing dull with age. But etched into the steel, barely visible beneath years of grime and use, was something no one expected. A trident. Wrapped in barbed wire, beneath it, in tiny letters, the words, "Devgru 7. Task Unit Wraith." Blackwell's face went pale. The smile that had been playing at the corners of his mouth vanished. His hand, which had been reaching toward the watch, froze in midair. His eyes widened, just a fraction, and his breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered. "That is not possible." He looked up at Dorian, really looked at him. Not as a technician, not as a nobody, but as someone he had seen before, in classified briefings and mission reports that no longer existed. "It is possible, sir," Dorian said quietly. The hangar was silent. No one understood what was happening, but they could feel it. The shift in the air, the way Blackwell had gone rigid, his face drained of color, the way Dorian stood there, calm and still, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. From which part of the world are you watching this? If stories like this make you think about the people we pass every day without truly seeing them, I would be honored if you subscribed. What Admiral Blackwell saw on that watch was about to change everything. The watch sat between them like a live wire. Blackwell stared at the engraving as if it might disappear if he blinked. His hand trembled slightly, still frozen in the air. Around them, the hangar had gone unnaturally quiet. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the distant roar of jet engines seemed muted, pushed to the edges of awareness by the weight of whatever was unfolding. Grissom stood a few feet away, his confident grin fading into confusion. He looked at Fellman, who shrugged, equally lost. Lena had moved closer, her eyes narrowed, trying to read the situation. She had seen admirals before. She had seen inspections go wrong, equipment fail, officers lose their composure under pressure. But she had never seen anything like this. The color had completely drained from Blackwell's face. His jaw was tight, his breathing shallow. Dorian did not move. He stood perfectly still, his wrist turned just enough to display the watch, his eyes locked on the Admiral. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction. Just a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that passed between two people who shared a secret the rest of the world was not allowed to know. Blackwell's lips moved, forming words that did not quite come out. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to shake off a hallucination. "That unit," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That unit does not exist." Dorian's expression did not change. "It existed, sir." Blackwell took a step back. His aides, sensing something was wrong, moved closer, but he waved them off with a sharp gesture. "Everyone out," he said, his voice suddenly loud and commanding. "Now." The junior officer nearest to him hesitated. "Sir?" Blackwell turned on him, his eyes blazing. "Clear the hangar. Everyone. Move." The effect was immediate. Officers scrambled toward the exits. Junior techs grabbed their gear and filed out in confused silence. Grissom shot one last bewildered look at Dorian before following the crowd. Lena lingered at the doorway, her hand on the frame, watching as the hangar emptied. Something in her gut told her she was witnessing something important, something that would ripple outward in ways she could not yet predict. But Blackwell's glare left no room for argument. She turned and walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The sound of the door closing echoed through the now empty hangar. Blackwell stood in the center of the vast space, surrounded by jets and equipment, but utterly alone with Dorian. The silence was suffocating. Blackwell walked to a nearby tool cart and leaned against it, his legs suddenly unsteady. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "You are dead," he said, finally. "You are all dead. We pulled you from the TOC records in 2014. Kandahar, the ambush at Spin Boldock. The entire unit was listed as killed in action." Dorian crossed his arms. "Not the entire unit." Blackwell looked up sharply. "How many?" "3 of us made it out. 2 are buried under different names in Arlington. Fake identities, fake families, medals they will never receive. I am the only one still breathing." Blackwell pressed his palms against the tool cart, steadying himself. "Why did you not come forward? Why disappear?" Dorian's voice was calm, almost detached. "Because you gave us the choice, sir. New identity and a pension, or become a liability the agency eliminates. I chose my daughter." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Blackwell closed his eyes, his jaw working as if he were chewing on something bitter. "I was the intel officer on that operation," he said quietly. "I signed off on your coordinates. When the ISI turned on you, when the Taliban closed the net, I was told to pull air support, plausible deniability. They said it was the only way to protect the larger mission. I thought you all died." "We almost did," Dorian said. 72 hours, no exfil, no air support, just 16 operators and 34 contractors depending on us to hold that compound. Blackwell looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "You held it." Dorian's gaze was steady. We did not have a choice. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of decisions made a decade ago. Blackwell straightened, his hands still shaking. "What you did," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Holding that position. Getting those people out. That was beyond anything we had a right to ask of you." Dorian did not respond. He just stood there, his arms still crossed, his face unreadable. Blackwell pushed off the tool cart and stood at attention. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and saluted. It was not a casual gesture. It was the kind of salute reserved for the dead, for memorials and flag-draped coffins. His hand was steady now, his posture rigid with respect. "You earned more than I will ever wear on my chest," Blackwell said. Dorian stared at him for a long moment. Then, almost reluctantly, he returned the salute. His movements were precise, practiced, the muscle memory of a life he had tried to leave behind. When he lowered his hand, he said quietly, "Permission to get back to work, sir." Blackwell nodded, his throat tight. "Granted." Dorian picked up his wrench and returned to the fuel pump, as if nothing had happened. Blackwell watched him for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the hangar door. His legs felt heavy, his chest tight. When he pushed open the door, he was met by a crowd of officers and techs pressed against the windows, their faces filled with confusion and curiosity. Blackwell straightened his uniform and stepped into the sunlight. His voice, when he spoke, was like iron. "Dorian Ashlock is not a civilian," he said, his words carrying across the assembled crowd. "He is a veteran of a classified DevGru unit that saved American lives under impossible odds. His actions are still buried in files you will never see. If I ever hear disrespect toward him again, if I even hear his name said without reverence, you will answer to me personally. Are we clear?" The crowd stammered in unison. "Yes, sir." Blackwell walked away without another word. His aides hurried to catch up, but he waved them off. He needed air. He needed space to process what had just happened. The ghost he thought he had buried a decade ago was alive, working in a hangar, raising a daughter, living a quiet life. And now, because of a stupid joke and a careless moment, that ghost was visible again. Inside the hangar, Dorian tightened the last bolt on the fuel pump. He wiped his hands on a rag, checked the pressure gauge, and logged the work in the maintenance system. His movements were methodical, unchanged, but his jaw was tight and his eyes were distant, focused on something far beyond the walls of the hangar. Outside, Grissom stood frozen, his face pale. "I did not know," he stammered to no one in particular. "I swear I did not know." Lena stepped up beside him, her voice quiet but firm. "None of us did. And that is the point." She turned and walked back into the hangar. Dorian was still at his workstation, his back to the door. She approached slowly, her footsteps echoing on the concrete. When she reached his station, she stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. Dorian looked up from his clipboard. "You need something?" Lena hesitated. "Just wanted to check if you were okay." Dorian set down his clipboard and met her gaze. His expression softened, just slightly. "I am fine. Thanks for asking." She nodded, but did not leave. "For what it is worth," she said quietly. "I always knew you were more than you let on. I just did not know how much." Dorian offered a faint smile. "Sometimes it is better that way." Lena lingered for another moment, then turned and walked back to her station. As she passed Grissom, she shot him a look that could have stripped paint. He avoided her eyes and slunk toward the break room, his earlier bravado completely deflated. The rest of the shift passed in uneasy silence. Word of the incident spread quickly, filtering through the base like wildfire. By the time Dorian clocked out at 1500 hours, everyone knew his name. People whispered as he walked past. A few nodded respectfully. Most just stared, trying to reconcile the quiet technician they had ignored for years with the man an Admiral had saluted. Dorian ignored them all. He walked to his truck, a battered Ford with rust spots on the fenders and a cracked windshield. He tossed his lunch bag onto the passenger seat, climbed in, and started the engine. The radio crackled to life, playing classic rock at low volume. He sat there for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard. Then he pulled out his phone and checked the time. 3:10. He was going to be early. The drive to Ripley's school took 15 minutes. The elementary school was a low, sprawling building, surrounded by chain-link fences and patchy grass. Kids poured out of the double doors in waves, shouting and laughing, their backpacks bouncing as they ran toward waiting parents. Dorian parked near the curb and waited, his eyes scanning the crowd. Ripley emerged a few minutes later, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, her arms wrapped around a papier-mâché volcano. She spotted the truck and broke into a grin, weaving through the other kids with practiced ease. Dorian climbed out and met her halfway, taking the volcano from her arms. "Careful," she said, her voice serious. "It took me 3 days to make that." "I will guard it with my life," Dorian said, setting it gently on the passenger seat. Ripley climbed into the truck and buckled her seatbelt. "Dad," Mrs. Chen said, "my volcano was the best in the class." Dorian smiled, pulling out of the parking lot. "That is because it was." Ripley beamed, swinging her legs. "Some kids at school were talking about you today. They said you are famous. They saw a video." Dorian's smile faded slightly. He kept his eyes on the road. "People talk, kiddo. Does not mean it is important." Ripley tilted her head, studying him. "Were you in the military? Like, for real?" Dorian's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "A long time ago." "Were you a hero?" Dorian was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the truck over to the side of the road and turned to face her. "Heroes are the people who come home and keep going," he said quietly. "That is all I did." Ripley studied his face, her young eyes serious. "Then you are a hero." Dorian reached over and ruffled her hair. "Let us get you home. You have homework." She groaned dramatically, and the moment passed. But as Dorian pulled back onto the road, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. A black SUV was parked 3 cars back, its windows tinted, its engine idling. It had been there when they arrived at the school. It was still there now. Dorian's jaw tightened. He turned left at the next intersection, watching the mirror. The SUV turned left as well. He took another turn, this time onto a residential street. The SUV followed. Dorian's mind raced, calculating distances, exits, options. He kept his expression calm, his voice light. "Hey, Ripley," he said. "How about you spend the weekend at Aunt Maurice's?" Ripley frowned. "But Dad, the science fair is Monday." "I know, and I will be there. I promise. But I need you safe first." Ripley looked at him, her frown deepening. "Safe from what?" Dorian forced a smile. "Just want to make sure you have time to practice your presentation. Aunt Marisa will help." Ripley did not look convinced, but she nodded. "Okay." Dorian drove the rest of the way in silence, the black SUV maintaining its distance. When they pulled into the driveway of their small apartment complex, the SUV drove past without slowing. Dorian watched it disappear around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside the apartment, Dorian set Ripley's volcano on the kitchen table and started packing her overnight bag. Ripley sat on the couch, her backpack at her feet, watching him with quiet concern. She did not ask questions. She had learned a long time ago that when her father got quiet like this, it was better to just listen. Dorian's phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up and read the message. "Unknown number. You were supposed to stay invisible." He deleted it without responding. A moment later, another message came through. "They know about Ripley." Dorian set the phone down and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet. No black SUV, no suspicious cars. But that did not mean they were not watching. He pulled the blinds shut and turned back to Ripley. "Ready to go?" She nodded, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. Dorian grabbed her overnight bag and led her out to the truck. The drive to Marissa's house took 20 minutes. Marissa was Dorian's younger sister, a nurse who worked long shifts at the hospital and had a soft spot for her niece. When Dorian pulled up to her house, she was already waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, her expression worried. "Everything okay?" she asked as Ripley ran up the steps. "Just need her out of the way for a few days," Dorian said quietly. Maritta's eyes narrowed. "Out of the way of what?" Dorian did not answer. He kissed Ripley on the forehead, told her he would see her Monday, and climbed back into his truck. Marissa watched him drive away, her worry deepening. Back at his apartment, Dorian locked the door and drew all the blinds. He sat at the small desk in his bedroom and opened his laptop. The watch sat beside him, its scratched face catching the dim light. He opened the back casing with a small screwdriver, revealing a compartment he had never shown anyone. Inside was a micro SD card, no bigger than a fingernail. He inserted it into the laptop and waited as the files loaded. Mission logs, classified communications, names of senators, contractors, intelligence officers, coordinates of black sites, video footage from helmet cams, showing DevGru 7 operators holding a compound under fire, protecting civilians while Washington debated whether to acknowledge them. Dorian copied the files onto 3 encrypted USB drives. He addressed 3 envelopes. The Washington Post, Senator Callaway, Armed Services Committee, Admiral Soren Blackwell. If they came for him, the truth would go public. If they came for Ripley, the world would know what had been buried. His phone rang. Unknown number, he answered. Mr. Ashlock, the voice said. Cold, professional, or should I say, Petty Officer Ashlock. Who is this? Someone who wants you to go back to being invisible. Quietly. No interviews, no more videos, no congressional hearings. And if I do not, then Ripley becomes an orphan. And this time, you will actually be dead. Dorian's voice was ice. You touch my daughter, and every file I have goes to every news outlet in the country. You will have senators in handcuffs by Monday. The line went silent. Then, you are bluffing. Try me, Dorian said, and hung up. He sat in the darkness, the watch ticking softly on the desk. Outside, the black SUV pulled up across the street, its engine idling. Inside, 2 men watched the apartment, waiting for orders. If you have ever felt invisible, or known someone who sacrificed everything without recognition, please take a moment to subscribe, because what happens next will decide whether the truth stays buried or finally sees the light. The phone call ended, but the silence that followed felt louder than any words. Dorian sat motionless at his desk, the watch still in his hand, its ticking the only sound in the apartment. Outside, the streetlights flickered on as dust settled over the neighborhood. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the air inside felt heavy, charged with the weight of decisions that could not be undone. He stood and walked to the window, carefully pulling back the edge of the blind. The black SUV was still there, parked under a tree across the street. No headlights, no movement, just waiting. Dorian let the blind fall back into place and returned to his desk. He picked up the 3 USB drives, each one labeled in his precise handwriting, and slipped them into padded envelopes. Then he addressed each one carefully, double-checking the names and addresses. These were not backups. They were insurance. They were the difference between disappearing quietly and making sure the truth outlived him. He sealed the envelopes and set them in his messenger bag. Tomorrow, he would mail them from 3 different post offices. If anything happened to him, if he missed even one check-in call with the recipients, the files would be opened. The evidence would go public. The names would be exposed. The mission that never officially existed would become front-page news. Dorian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought about Ripley, safe at Maurice's house, probably doing her homework at the kitchen table while her aunt made dinner. He thought about the volcano sitting in his truck, carefully wrapped in a towel to keep it from breaking. He thought about the promise he had made to her, that he would be at the science fair on Monday. He intended to keep that promise, but first, he had to make sure there would be a Monday. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Admiral Blackwell. My office? 0800 tomorrow. Not a request. Dorian stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back a single word. Understood. He set the phone down and stood, moving through the apartment with quiet efficiency. He locked the windows, checked the door, set a chair under the handle as an extra precaution. Then he sat on the edge of his bed, the watch still on his wrist, and waited for morning. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound outside made him tense, the hum of a passing car, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of wind through the trees. He lay in the darkness, his eyes open, his mind running through contingencies and escape routes. He thought about the men who had died at Spin Boldak. Their faces came to him in the darkness, as clear as if they were standing in the room. Hendricks, the team medic who had kept 3 wounded contractors alive through sheer force of will. Vance, the demolitions expert who had rigged the compound's perimeter with improvised defenses using nothing but scavenged materials. Cortez, the youngest of them, barely 23, who had held the north wall alone for 6 hours when everyone else was pinned down. They had deserved better than unmarked graves and fake names. They had deserved to be remembered, and now, maybe, they would be. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, Dorian had barely slept an hour. He rose, showered, and dressed in the same gray coveralls he wore every day. He made coffee, drank it black, and ate a piece of toast standing at the counter. At 7:30, he grabbed his messenger bag, locked the apartment, and walked to his truck. The black SUV was gone, but Dorian knew better than to think he was alone. They were watching. They were always watching. The drive to the base was quiet. The morning traffic was light, and the roads were still damp from an early rain. Dorian parked in his usual spot near Hangar 7 and walked toward the administrative building. Officers passed him in the hallways, and this time, they did not ignore him. Some nodded, some saluted. A few stopped and stared, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. Dorian kept his head down and kept walking. Admiral Blackwell's office was on the 3rd floor, a corner suite with a view of the airfield. Dorian knocked once and waited. A voice from inside called out, "Enter." Dorian pushed open the door. Blackwell was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, watching a pair of jets taxi toward the runway. He did not turn around when Dorian entered. "Close the door," he said quietly. Dorian closed the door and stood at ease, his hands at his sides. Blackwell finally turned to face him. He looked older than he had the day before, as if the weight of the past 24 hours had aged him years. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes were tired, rimmed with red. "Sit," Blackwell said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Dorian sat. Blackwell moved to his desk and opened a folder, pulling out a stack of papers. He set them in front of Dorian without a word. Dorian glanced down and saw the mission reports, the casualty lists, the classified briefings that detailed the operation at Spin Boldak. Names he had not seen in a decade, faces he had tried to forget. "I spent all night reading these," Blackwell said, his voice rough. "I had to request special clearance just to access them. Most of this is still classified, still buried, but I read every word." Dorian said nothing. He just stared at the papers, his jaw tight. "You and your team held that compound for 72 hours, Blackwell continued. "No reinforcements, no air support. The Taliban threw everything they had at you, mortars, RPGs, wave after wave of fighters. And you held. You got every single contractor out alive. Not one American casualty among the civilians." Dorian's voice was quiet. "We lost 3 operators." Blackwell nodded slowly. "I know. Hendricks, Vance, Cortez. Their names are in these files, buried under classification stamps and redactions. And those men deserve recognition. They deserve to be remembered. But the people who made the call to abandon you, the people who decided it was politically inconvenient to acknowledge what you did, they buried it. They erased you." Dorian looked up, his eyes hard. "I know, sir. I was there." Blackwell leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "I am submitting your unit for posthumous recognition. Navy Crosses. All 16 of you. It is going to take years to declassify everything, but I am starting the process today. I have already contacted Senator Callaway on the Armed Services Committee. He is on board. This is happening." Dorian shook his head slowly. "I do not want a medal, sir." Blackwell's voice was firm. "This is not about you. This is about your brothers. They deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve to know the truth. The country deserves to know what was done in their name and what was sacrificed." Dorian was silent for a long moment, his hands resting on his knees. Then he nodded slowly. "Understood." Blackwell sat back in his chair, his expression softening. "And Dorian, if they come for you or your daughter, you call me. I do not care what I have to burn down. I owe you that much. We all do." Dorian met his gaze. "Copy that, sir." Blackwell reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. He slid it across the desk. "My personal number, not my office line, not my assistant. Me. Use it if you need to." Dorian took the card and slipped it into his pocket. He stood, offered a brief salute, and turned to leave. "Ashlock," Blackwell called after him. Dorian paused at the door and looked back. "You did good," Blackwell said quietly. "Better than any of us had a right to ask. Better than most men could have done. I want you to know that." Dorian nodded once, his throat tight, then walked out, closing the door behind him. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. Dorian returned to the hangar and went back to work, but everything felt different. The other techs gave him space, their earlier mockery replaced by a quiet, awkward respect. Lena checked in on him twice, offering coffee and asking if he needed anything. Grissom avoided him entirely, his earlier bravado replaced by shame so profound he could barely make eye contact. At noon, Dorian received a text from Marisa. "Ripley wants to know if you are coming to her presentation practice tonight." Dorian smiled faintly and typed back, "Tell her I will be there." But as the afternoon wore on, Dorian noticed something else. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications. At first, he ignored them, assuming they were spam. But when he finally checked during his break, his stomach dropped. The video of Blackwell saluting him had gone viral. Someone had filmed it from outside the hangar, the shaky footage showing the moment Blackwell's hand rose in salute, the crowd of officers and techs standing frozen in shock. The video had been posted to a military forum, then shared to Reddit, then picked up by Twitter and Instagram. Within hours, it had millions of views. The comments ranged from awe to conspiracy theories. "Who is this guy?" one person wrote. "Why did an admiral salute a civilian?" Another comment read, "This man is a ghost. Look at the way he stands. That is not a technician. That is an operator." Someone else had posted, "I served with guys like this. They do not talk about what they did. They just do their job and go home." Respect. Dorian closed his phone and shoved it into his pocket. The attention was the last thing he wanted. Attention meant questions. Questions meant investigations. And investigations meant danger, not just for him, but for Ripley. The people who had threatened him were still out there, watching, waiting to see what he would do next. By the time he clocked out at 1500, the base was buzzing with rumors. Some said Dorian was a former SEAL. Others claimed he was CIA. A few insisted he was part of a black ops unit that had never officially existed. Dorian ignored them all and drove straight to Marissa's house. When he arrived, Ripley was waiting on the porch, her volcano cradled in her arms. She ran to the truck, her face lit up with excitement. "Dad," she said breathlessly. Mrs. Chen called. She said my volcano might win first place. Dorian lifted her into the truck and set the volcano carefully on the seat between them. "That is because you worked hard on it." Ripley buckled her seatbelt and looked at him, her expression suddenly serious. "Dad, are you in trouble?" Dorian glanced at her, surprised. "Why would you ask that?" "Because Aunt Marisa has been acting weird, and you look tired, and some kids at school said their parents were talking about you." Dorian forced a smile. "I am fine, kiddo. Just a busy week." Ripley did not look convinced, but she nodded and turned her attention back to the volcano. Dorian pulled out of the driveway and headed toward the elementary school. The science fair presentations were scheduled for that evening, and Ripley had been practicing her speech for days. Dorian had promised to be there, and he was not about to break that promise. The school gymnasium was packed with parents and students when they arrived. Tables lined the walls, each one displaying a different project. Volcanoes, solar systems, plant growth experiments, and homemade circuits filled the space with color and energy. The air smelled like poster board and glue, and the hum of excited conversation filled every corner. Ripley set up her volcano at her assigned table and stood beside it, nervously adjusting the painted papered lava. Dorian stood off to the side, his arms crossed, watching her with quiet pride. She looked so small standing there, surrounded by other kids and their elaborate projects. But she held her head high, her confidence growing as parents and teachers stopped to admire her work. One mother asked Ripley to explain how the volcano worked, and Ripley launched into her presentation with enthusiasm, her hands gesturing as she described the chemical reaction between baking soda and vinegar. A voice beside him said, "She is a natural." Dorian turned to see Lena standing next to him, a small smile on her face. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Lena shrugged. "My nephew is presenting, saw you, and thought I would say hi." Dorian nodded, his gaze returning to Ripley. "She has been working on that thing for weeks." Lena was quiet for a moment, watching Ripley explain her project to another group of parents. Then she said, "For what it is worth, I am sorry. For how everyone treated you. For how I treated you." "I should have seen it," Dorian glanced at her. You did not treat me any differently than I asked to be treated. Lena frowned. What do you mean? Dorian's voice was quiet. I wanted to be invisible. It was safer that way. For me. For Ripley. If people do not notice you, they do not ask questions. And if they do not ask questions, they do not dig. Lena studied him, her expression thoughtful. And now that everyone knows? Now, Dorian said, his jaw tightening. I just want to keep my daughter safe. That is all that matters. Before Lena could respond, the principal stepped up to the microphone and called for attention. The presentations were about to begin. Dorian moved closer to Ripley's table, standing where she could see him. She looked up, caught his eye, and smiled. He smiled back, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The threats, the surveillance, the viral video. None of it mattered. Only this moment. Only Ripley. Ripley's presentation was flawless. She explained the science behind volcanic eruptions with confidence, demonstrated the reaction with baking soda and vinegar, and answered every question the judges asked with clarity and enthusiasm. The volcano erupted right on cue, foam bubbling over the sides in a cascade of red and orange. The judges nodded approvingly, making notes on their clipboards. When she finished, the crowd applauded, and Dorian felt a swell of pride so strong it almost hurt. After the presentations, as parents and students filtered out of the gymnasium, Dorian knelt down beside Ripley and wrapped her in a hug. You did great, kiddo. Ripley beamed, her face flushed with excitement. Do you think I will win? Dorian ruffled her hair. You already did. They walked out to the truck together, Ripley chattering excitedly about the other projects and the judges' questions. Dorian listened, his heart lighter than it had been in days. For a few precious hours, he had been just a dad, watching his daughter shine. Nothing else mattered, not the past, not the threats, just this. But as they drove home, Dorian's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Admiral Blackwell. You need to see this. Attached was a news article. The headline read, Viral video sparks questions about classified Navy unit. The article detailed the video of Blackwell's salute, speculated about Dorian's identity, and quoted anonymous sources claiming that DevGru 7 had been involved in covert operations that were never publicly acknowledged. The story was already being picked up by major outlets. CNN, Fox News, The Washington Post. Everyone wanted to know who Dorian Ashlock was and why an admiral had saluted him. Dorian's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The truth was coming out whether he wanted it to or not. The question now was whether he could control the narrative or whether it would spiral into something he could not contain. That night, after Ripley was asleep, Dorian sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He drafted an email to the Washington Post, attaching the files from the USB drive. He did not include his name or contact information, just the files and a single sentence. This is the truth about Spin Boldak. The men who died there deserve to be remembered. He hovered over the send button for a long moment, his finger trembling slightly. This was the point of no return. Once he sent this, there would be no taking it back. The truth would be out there, permanent and unchangeable. The people who had threatened him would know he had followed through, but they would also know that killing him would not bury the truth anymore. It was already out there, waiting to be discovered. Dorian clicked send. The email disappeared into the void, carrying with it the last remnants of a mission the government had tried to erase. Dorian closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, exhausted but strangely calm. The next morning, the story broke. Major news outlets ran with it, detailing the classified operation, the abandonment of DevGru 7, and the cover-up that followed. The files Dorian had sent contained mission logs, video footage from helmet cameras, communications between intelligence officers and Pentagon officials. The evidence was undeniable. DevGru 7 had existed. They had been sent into an impossible situation. And when things went wrong, they had been abandoned and erased. Senators were called to testify. The CIA issued a statement denying involvement, then retracted it hours later when more evidence surfaced. The Defense Department launched an internal investigation. And Dorian's name, though not officially confirmed by any government source, was whispered in every conversation, shared in every online forum, speculated about in every news segment. Admiral Blackwell held a press conference that afternoon, standing at a podium in full-dress uniform, flanked by the flags of the United States and the Navy. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones extended. Blackwell stood tall, his expression grave, his voice steady. "I am here today to confirm the existence of a classified operation that took place in Kandahar province in 2014, he began. A team of Navy SEALs, operating under the designation DEV-GRU-7, was tasked with protecting a group of American contractors during an intelligence operation. When the situation deteriorated, that team held their position for 72 hours under sustained enemy fire. They evacuated every civilian under their protection. Not one American contractor died, but in the process, we lost 3 operators, and for political reasons, their sacrifice was classified. Their families were told they died in training accidents. Their names were erased from official records. The room erupted with questions, but Blackwell held up a hand. "I will not be taking questions about operational details. Those remain classified. But I can tell you this. The men of DEV-GRU-7 exhibited extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. They deserve to be recognized, and I am personally recommending that they be posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. It is long overdue." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "Some truths," he said quietly, "are still classified. But the men who fought that day deserve to be honored, and I intend to make sure they are." With that, Blackwell stepped away from the podium and left the room, ignoring the shouted questions from reporters. The press conference was over, but the story was just beginning. The following Monday, Dorian stood in the back of the elementary school gymnasium, watching as Ripley accepted a first-place ribbon for her volcano. She held it up proudly, her face glowing with joy, her smile so wide it seemed to take up her entire face. Dorian clapped along with the other parents, his heart full, his eyes burning slightly. After the ceremony, they walked out to the truck together, Ripley clutching her ribbon and chattering about what project she would do next year. "Maybe a robot," she said excitedly, "or something with electricity. Or maybe I will grow plants and see which ones grow fastest." Dorian listened, his hand resting on her shoulder, the weight of the past few days slowly lifting. As they drove home, Dorian glanced at the watch on his wrist. The trident and barbed wire were still there, faint and worn, a reminder of a life he had tried to leave behind. But now, looking at it, he felt something different. Not shame, not regret. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some things could not be erased, no matter how hard you tried, and maybe they were not supposed to be. That evening, as the sun set over the base, Dorian sat on the steps of his apartment, watching Ripley play in the courtyard. The black SUV had not returned. The threats had stopped. The men who had wanted him silenced had retreated, their leverage gone now that the truth was public. There was nothing left to threaten him with. The story was out there. The evidence was undeniable, and the men of DEV-GRU-7 would finally be remembered. Dorian's phone buzzed. A message from Admiral Blackwell. "Well done. Your brothers would be proud." Dorian typed back a single word. "Thanks." He set the phone down and leaned back against the railing, the watch ticking softly on his wrist. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. The mission was over. The secrets were out. And the men who had died in the desert would finally be remembered. Not as training accidents, not as classified casualties, but as heroes who had done their duty when no one else could. Ripley ran up to him, breathless and grinning. "Dad, can we get ice cream?" Dorian smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Sure, kiddo, let us go." They climbed into the truck and drove toward the small ice cream shop on the edge of town. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. Ripley sang along to the radio, her voice off-key but filled with joy. Dorian listened, his hand resting on the steering wheel, the watch visible on his wrist. At the ice cream shop, Ripley ordered a double scoop of chocolate with sprinkles. Dorian ordered a single scoop of vanilla. They sat outside at a picnic table, watching the last light fade from the sky. Ripley swung her legs and talked about school, about her friends, about the science fair, and how she hoped her teacher would put her project on display in the hallway. Dorian listened to every word, his heart full in a way it had not been in years. This was what he had fought for, not medals, not recognition, just this. A quiet evening with his daughter, eating ice cream and watching the stars come out. A normal life, a safe life. As they drove home, Ripley fell asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. Dorian glanced over at her, her face peaceful, her ribbon clutched in her hand. He thought about the men he had lost, Hendricks, Vance, Cortez. They had not gotten to go home. They had not gotten to watch their kids grow up. But they had made it possible for others to do so. And now, finally, they would be remembered. When they got home, Dorian carried Ripley inside and tucked her into bed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep, then quietly closed the door. He walked to the kitchen and made himself a cup of tea. He sat at the table, the watch on his wrist catching the dim light from the overhead fixture. His phone buzzed one more time, a message from an unknown number, but this time, the message was different. "Thank you. My husband was on that team. We were told he died in a training accident. Now I know the truth. Thank you for not letting him be forgotten." Dorian stared at the message for a long time, his throat tight. Then he typed back, "He was a hero." That's all were. He set the phone down and took a sip of his tea. Outside, the night was quiet. The streets were empty. The black SUV was gone. And for the first time in a decade, Dorian Ashlock felt like he could breathe. The watch ticked steadily on his wrist, each second a reminder of the past, but also a promise for the future. The mission was over, the truth was out, and the men who had been erased were finally being remembered. Over the following weeks, more families reached out, wives, children, parents who had been told their sons died in accidents, never knowing the truth. Dorian did not respond to most of them. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to the government, to the Navy, to the people who had buried the truth in the first place. Admiral Blackwell kept his word. The process of declassification began, slow and bureaucratic, but moving forward. A memorial service was planned. The families would be notified officially. The men of DevGru 7 would receive their Navy crosses, presented to their families in a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Dorian was invited to attend. He declined. He had said his goodbyes a long time ago, standing in the ruins of a compound in Afghanistan, watching as the bodies of his brothers were loaded onto helicopters. He did not need a ceremony to remember them. They were with him every day, in the watch on his wrist, in the quiet moments when he thought about what they had sacrificed. But he did send a letter to be read at the ceremony. It was short, just a few lines. These men did their duty when no one else could. They held the line when the world turned its back. They deserve to be remembered not as casualties, but as heroes, and I will carry their memory with me for the rest of my life. The letter was read aloud by Admiral Blackwell, his voice steady, but his eyes damp. The families wept. The crowd stood in silence, and somewhere, far away, Dorian Ashlock sat on the steps of his apartment, watching his daughter play, knowing that the men he had fought beside were finally at peace. Life slowly returned to normal. The media moved on to other stories. The viral video faded from the headlines. Dorian went back to work at the hangar, though now the other techs treated him with quiet respect. Grissom apologized, stammering through an explanation that Dorian cut short with a simple nod. There was no point in holding grudges. The past was the past. Lena invited him to join the crew for lunch one day. Dorian accepted, sitting at the table and listening to the conversation without contributing much. But he was there. He was part of the team, and that was enough. Ripley continued to thrive. She won first place in the district science fair, her volcano beating out dozens of other projects. She came home with a trophy and a certificate, her face glowing with pride. Dorian hung the certificate on the refrigerator, right next to her school photos and drawings. At night, after Ripley was asleep, Dorian sometimes took out the watch and opened the back casing. The micro SD card was gone, sent to the Washington Post. Its contents now public record, but the watch itself remained, a physical reminder of everything he had been through. He would hold it in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the scratches and dents that told a story no one else could read. And then he would close it, put it back on his wrist, and go to bed. Because the story was not over. It was just beginning a new chapter, one where the past was acknowledged, the truth was known, and the future was his to shape. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Dorian received a package in the mail. It was unmarked, no return address, just a plain brown box. He opened it carefully, half expecting trouble. Inside was a folded flag, the kind presented at military funerals, and beneath it, a letter. The letter was from the widow of one of his teammates. She thanked him for telling the truth. She thanked him for making sure her husband was remembered, and she told him that her son, now 14, wanted to join the Navy. He wants to be like his father, she wrote. Because of you, he knows who his father really was. Thank you for giving us that. Dorian folded the letter carefully and set it on his desk. He stared at the flag for a long time, his eyes burning. Then he stood, walked to Ripley's room, and knocked gently on the door. Yeah, she called out. Dorian opened the door. She was sitting on her bed, reading a book. Just wanted to say goodnight, he said. Ripley looked up and smiled. Good night, Dad. Love you. Love you too, kiddo. He closed the door and walked back to the kitchen. The watch ticked on his wrist, steady and constant. The sun had set and the apartment was quiet. But it was a good quiet, a peaceful quiet. The kind that came from knowing you had done the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it cost you everything. Dorian poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. He looked out the window at the darkening sky, the stars just beginning to appear. And he thought about the men who would never see another sunset, the men who had given everything so that others could go home, the men who deserved to be remembered. And they were. Finally, after all these years, they were. If you have ever known someone whose story deserved to be told, or if you believe that courage should never be erased, I hope you will take a moment to share this and subscribe. Because the greatest heroes are often the ones we walk past every day without ever knowing their names. And sometimes, a simple watch is the only proof that they were ever there at all. But now, because one man refused to let the truth die, their names are known, their sacrifices are honored, and their memories will live on.